I'm Mei Yong and joined Evonik recently and succeeding Peter Morfeld to take over the Institute for Occupational Epidemiology and Risk Assessment. So I'm very glad to be here. I will focus on reviewing the literature on coal miners with potential lung overload. First of all, a very brief introduction why we made effort to review the literature on coal miners on a TiO2 symposium. First of all, coal miner dust are also characterized as granular biopersistent particles without a known specific toxicology, in briefly GBS. So they have the similar property to TiO2. And second reason is over 1 million coal miner workers exposed to coal dust. There's a very large and well-studied occupational group to provide sufficient statistical power to detect a very minor adverse effect, if potentially. Third, exposure to coal miner dust has a larger magnitude than that to TiO2. So therefore, the studies of coal miners would provide the best evidence for using lung overload models or epidemiological findings concerning lung cancer risks. But last but not the least, ICA used the coal miner studies to test the hypothesis whether the lung response to high burdens to GBS can be qualitatively similar in rats and humans. So that's the reason we want to review the data very cautiously. First, let's look at the human evidence in respect to lung overload. In this sense, the US investigators have examined this respect very intensively. And Kumper et al. 2001, they used the pathologic data from 131 coal miners to use it in the dosimetric study. And they found the coal miners' average age 67 at death, with an average exposure duration of 36 years at death, and yielded an average cumulative dust exposure of 107 milligram year per cubic meter. That equals to a mean coal mine dust concentration of 3 milligram per cubic meter. They found the mean lung dust burden at that death 13.8 gram, while the mean lymph dust burden was 1.8. They referred to the dosimetric model Kumper developed in her PhD thesis, and they found if the model with no clearance, no step-down clearance, this model fit the model the best when analyzing the autopsy data. And the UK investigators used a larger data set of 423 coal miners with the corresponding equivalent exposure data, and they found the same results. So there's very strong indication that no lung overload developed in the US and the UK coal miners. For more detailed information, Kumper developed a 3-compartment model, which consists of deposition of the inhaled particles in alveolar regions. And the second compartment, there's a competing process of either clearance from the alveolar region or translocation to the in-tissue regions. And the third compartment is a very slowly and irreversible sequestration of interstitial materials in the lymph nodes. And they tested the model and found that there's no clearance breakdown fit the lung burden on best in the US and in the UK data as well. And there's very strong, convincing evidence there's no lung overload developed in the coal miners. And the screening and used the Bayesian analysis while Markov-Chain Monte Carlo model simulations combined both data set together from US and UK and confirmed the 3-compartment human long-term clearance and the retention model to provide the best fit. So there's a very strong evidence there's no lung overload in coal miners. Now let's look at the epidemiology data in Q miners to derive the relevance for overload. And here's the table. I listed all the cohort studies from coal miners since the 70s. We can see it is very obviously the older studies in the 70s, they delivered quite rather lower SMRs, and even they didn't give any information about the confidence interval. So my co-workers introduced very well that is very pronounced healthy worker effect here is to be demonstrated. So we don't want to overinterpret the results. And Kumper 1995, there is the US cohort. There is the first report reported from the US cohort using approximately 9,000 coal miners. And at that time, with 9 years follow-up, they delivered a deficit on lung cancer risk in their cohort. And here's Japanese studies. The Japanese studies primarily they focus on an interaction between the coal dust exposure and smoking. And they found employment more than 15 years yielded a marginally increased risk for lung cancer risk. And the follow-up, the extended follow-up from the US cohort are reported in 2008 and 2014. Now I will try to focus on the Germany cohort, the cohort from Germany, from the US, and from UK. And from the Germany studies, Peter and his co-workers recruit about 4,600 coal miners in Saar area in Germany with an average exposure duration 30 years with an equal individual mean exposure varied between 2.8 to 3.8 milligram per cubic meter according to low or high imputation scenarios. And that's information about the exposure. And the data have actually about 100% the vital status is very good data quality, and they recorded 98 lung cancer deaths from the cohort, and which yielded a standardized mortality ratio 0.8 with statistical significance. That means a statistical significant deficit on lung cancer deaths in this cohort. So the authors concluded there's no elevated lung cancer risk in German coal miners. And they have examined further those subset of the coal miners. They developed a coal worker pneumoconiosis with a higher category. They have a higher risk for lung cancer deaths, while those with a lower category, they didn't develop a higher risk of lung cancer mortality. And the UK study, there's the largest cohort ever we have. They included almost 18,000 from 10 British Collier. And this is the best information, best data ever we have in the coal miners, and they have complete job histories and so on. The exposure information is mean duration of 52 years altogether, and accumulated respiratory dust 98, almost approximately 100 gram per hour per cubic meter. I calculated in cubic meter, a milligram per cubic meter years, that corresponding to 56.8. That's quite comparable to the exposure in the German cohort. And they found the external analysis just below the unity, 0.986 without statistical significance, comparing with the regional rate. That will be a better reference rate than the national rate. And from the internal analysis, they found 1.03 without a statistical significance. And they used a time-dependent Cox proportional model. That means the model can adjust it for the healthy worker survival effect better than without. And also the authors conclude no elevated lung cancer risk in UK coal miners. The US cohort, 1995 was the first report from 9-year follow-up, and 2008, Artfield and Kumpo published an extended follow-up for 23 years follow-up. They found almost altogether 331 deaths, lung cancer deaths altogether, with comparable exposure information to the UK and German cohorts. They found at that time standardized mortality ratio 1.07 without a significant statistical significance, but comparing with the national rates. The authors concluded also there was no elevated lung cancer risk in US coal miners. They examined also, at the meantime, coal worker pneumoconiosis categories with the increasing CWP categories and in relationship to the selected death causes. For example, the all causes due to the nonviolent death causes, there is an increasing, actually the positive relationship. With the increasing category of CVP, they find also increasing SMR to the all-cause mortality, and they found also the positive relationship to the non-malignant respiratory diseases. But they found an inverse relationship to lung cancer, which is very interesting from this study. And the authors also examined increasing cumulative dust exposure to the SMRs. There is no apparent pattern at all. And during the different regions, there is a very considerable pattern to be seen. So the authors also acknowledge in their conclusion, there's no convincing evidence for an excess of lung cancer risk in their cohort at that time to 23 years follow-up. And the Graeber 2014 extended the follow-up to 37 years of follow-up. Again, they enrolled all the cohorts, the participants or coal miners between 1969 to 71. And they found in this report and marginally increased SMRs with marginal statistical significance 1.00 to 1.18 for lung cancer mortality. And from the internal analysis, according to the follow-up period, for the time period 2000 and 2007, they found a significantly increased risk for coal mine dust, but while there is no increased risk for respirable silica. So far to the results. So I would like to scrutinize this study in respect to exposure assessment and analysis methods as well. In respect to the exposure assessment in Graeber 2014, there's no complete assessment of occupational histories available in the coal mine workers because there is no information on jobs held after 1969 and 71. And especially there's no end date of working as a coal miner for over 15% of cohort members. Consequently, that we cannot address the healthy worker survival effect analytically. As Tom and Joe introduced, healthy worker survival effect is actually a continuing selection process. That means that the workers, they remained their employment tend to be more healthy than those left their employment early. So there will be a very strong bias to be adjusted for. If you don't have the information of the end of the date, so you cannot address this issue analytically. And at the meantime, you cannot use the time-dependent pattern incorporating the employment pattern and exposure in your internal analysis as well. And we found that actually the significant increase in risk for time period 2000 to 2007. And when we raised the question if there's a later stage phenomenon for lung cancer, but actually we can use the methods for lagging or lagging to address this issue. But if we don't have the end date who terminated their employment, so we cannot use this approach as well. So these are the limitations of exposure assessment and for very strong, severe consequences for internal analysis as well. And the second limitation is the cumulative exposure is quite crude. The cumulative exposure is defined to be the sum of the products of each job-specific dust concentration and the duration of time period, time worked at that job T. And if the job-specific, and they use the translation of limited environmental measurement from survey into the individual exposure data, and the specific jobs held could not be derived from the incomplete job histories. But the investigators made a very strong assumption that either the exposure level or the job activities they hold keep unchanged after the entry into the cohort. So the cumulative exposure must be very crude, and all the estimates from the internal analysis should be interpreted very cautiously. In addition, the silica measurements were only available only after 1982, but it had to be allocated to the jobs held before 69 and 71. So the exposure measurement or assessment are indeed very crude. But the investigators tried to done actually a sensitivity analysis from those subcohorts with complete job histories. And they found that those with complete job histories have larger cumulative coal mine dust than those for the cohort with or without complete job histories. But they argued in their discussion that the risk estimate from both cohorts are quite comparable. Now I come to the analysis methodologies. The weakness in external comparisons, we found here a very considerable heterogeneities according to the regions. And some had actually only the half of the 50% SMR comparing to the national rate. And while the other regions have the 50% increase to the reference populations. So there are very strong heterogeneities. And in this case, they will be very good to compare to the regional rates and summarize the findings together at the end and combine the results finally. And we have also found, the smoking prevalence is very high in this cohort. And smoking is a very profound, well-known confounders in relationship between coal dust and lung cancer risks. They also found a slight elevated SMR, adjusting for age, calendar year, sex, and race-specific mortality rates, but without adjusting for smoking status. And the cohort has at that time, and at the entry 1969 to 1961, they have the prevalence of current smoker of 54, much larger than that in the US male population to the same time period. And I don't have the information about the ever smoker and the non-smokers from the US male populations. But we still already have some approaches are already available to adjust the distortion because of the heterogeneity between the study group and the reference group in terms to the smoking behavior. There are the exosomes approach already published in 1978, and a Bayesian bias adjustment approach published by Steenland and Greenland 2004. And I recalculated the SMR tentatively, assuming the US male population ever smokers 31% and 25% prevalence of non-smokers. And I found the correct factor at least 1.2 to 1.6. That means I would turn down the SMR at least 20% downwards. But if we turn down actually 10% of the SMR, that means that the risk estimate will be below the unity. So there is here obviously an overestimate without adjusting for smoking behavior. Weakness in internal comparisons, there's a very interesting error in table 4. The authors delivered the beta coefficient from the Cox proportional hazard model. The beta coefficient was 0.0191, and this calculation is actually very simple. It would yielded a hazard ratio of 1.02, while the hazard ratio 1.136 was reported in the publication. I have no idea how did it came. And I mentioned the incomplete assessment of occupational histories in coal mine workers. There would be then the investigators would not be able to do the time-dependent handling either for the employment pattern or for the enclosure in the Cox proportional hazard models. What the UK study has done it. Healthy worker survival effect cannot be addressed analytically, and no lagging or logging analysis was possible in this study as well. And we found a very divergent effect according to the time period, and also they use quite a different period, 20 years, 10 years, and 8 years, and this cutoff points seem to be quite arbitrary, and substantial difference of risk estimates both in magnitudes and directions across the time periods. Summarizing all the results from the human studies, we found the dosimetry studies in humans, they providing very convincing evidence there is no lung overload developed in coal miners, and numerous studies in coal miner coal workers who have been exposed to relevant level of dust have not indicated increase of risk of cancer mortality. So therefore, classifying all GBS as carcinogenic to humans based on rat inhalation studies in which lung overload lead to chronic inflammation and cancer would be, in this case, inappropriate. With respect to all the numerous studies, but just draw a conclusion from methodologically not necessary superior studies would be not appropriate application of weight to evidence approach. And in the end, I would like to quote Sir Richard Doe, who described the role of epidemiology to explain the causal link. He said, epidemiology is certainly a poor tool for learning about the mechanism by which a disease is produced, but it has a tremendous advantage that it focuses on disease and deaths that actually occur in real setting. And experience has shown that it continues to be second to none as a means of discovering links in the chain of causation that are capable of being broken. So in this sense, I wish to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments? Yes. I think that will be your intervention number 9, Jan Prochaska.
I have a question. We don't buy coal from Evonik. We buy P25 several tons per year. And I would like to ask you about, for example, this paper from Professor Oberdoster. And he generally reports the influence of your material on rats at different concentrations. So I just wonder if you process these materials and if you take precautions in your production, and also if you provide such information to your customers.
So again, we actually come back to the actual translation of toxicology. If it is the evidence can be transferred to the epidemiology. There's always a gap between the findings from the tox data and to the epidemiology data. So that's the reason I want to quote this Richard Doe. If the tox data will be very useful to explain the mechanism pathways, but if you want to explain the link in the real exposure setting, then we have to come back to the evidence from the epidemiology study.
You have a follow-up?
Okay, do you have any numbers on titanium dioxide then? Evonik is a large producer of titanium dioxide. So my basic question is, why do you show coal mine numbers, not the TiO2 numbers? You must have a bunch of evidence from the TiO2 field.
Yeah, okay. You mean actually there is an appeal. What I understand is a very strong appeal to conduct more studies than using the older studies, right? You want to address this issue?
11.
Well, my question is, you are not a coal mining company. You make titanium dioxide. So why the discussion was on, say, methodology of coal mining epidemiological studies instead of your own experience with titanium dioxide?
Yeah.
So it's a question about the relevance of those data, really, isn't it?
And that's my first introduction, actually. Okay, first the history of the Evonik, and there was a very strong, I mean, Monica knows this better. Peter was involved very strongly in the coal mine studies. We collected the largest coal mine studies from the beginning of the Evonik. There is a quite different history of the Evonik. And then now still I'm continued all the follow-up from the coal mine studies, not only the mortality, but also the morbidity. We also look for the lung functions and the pneumoconiosis incidence and so on. For your first part of your questions. And the second is the TiO2. There is actually there's a study, Bofetta and so on, 2004 from the European study will be answer this question more better. But my suggestion will be keep on the extend the follow-up to look for the effect or link will be more better.
Okay, and Dr. Makane has been extremely patient. He also had a question at the end of the previous session.
Sure. The answer is the gentleman from Czech who asked the question about why, I don't think he's listening. The reason that we looked at coal miners is they are the one human population that might conceivably represent lung overload. So the point is to look at workers where there may in fact have been lung overload and to see whether the lung overload increased the risk of cancer. Now, granted, your question about TiO2 is germane, but TiO2 workers don't have the exposure that coal workers do. So that's why it was appropriate to look at coal workers. They have the most human exposure that could conceivably be considered lung overload.